If the algorithm sent you this video, it's because you're too fat or too skinny and it wants you to get it now. There's a moment most people recognize even if they've never put words to it. You wake up feeling off. Not sick exactly. Not sick enough to cancel anything or call in or make a doctor's appointment. Just wrong. Head a little thick, energy sitting somewhere below the floor, that low specific discomfort that doesn't quite have a name. And you do what you always do. You have coffee, maybe push through it, wait for it to pass. If it gets worse, you might take something. If it gets much worse, you might eventually see someone about it. But mostly you just wait. You've gotten very good at waiting things out. What's strange about this, and I've thought about it a lot, is that we are surrounded by food every hour of the day. We make decisions about what to eat constantly, multiple times a day, every single day of our lives. And almost none of those decisions have anything to do with how we actually feel. We eat for convenience, for taste, for habit, for comfort, for whatever's in the house. We almost never eat in response to what our body is actually signaling. We've lost the thread of that conversation so completely that when someone suggests eating a specific food for a specific symptom, it sounds either like folk medicine or like a supplement ad. It sounds like something your grandmother would say or like something you'd see in a sponsored post, and either way you're skeptical. You've been burned before by simple solutions that turned out to be more complicated than advertised. I want to talk about that skepticism directly because I share it and because I think it's worth examining honestly. The reason simple food remedies get dismissed so quickly isn't that they don't work. Some of them work remarkably well. Some of them have better research behind them than the over-the-counter products sitting in your medicine cabinet. The reason they get dismissed is that they've been flattened into a kind of wellness shorthand that strips out all the context that would make them make sense. Eat bananas for headaches. Okay, why? How many? When? Under what circumstances? The claim without the mechanism feels like a superstition. But the mechanism, when you actually understand it, is genuinely interesting, and it changes how you think about what your body is asking for when something feels wrong. That's the only thing I'm actually trying to do here. Not sell you anything, not give you a list to screenshot and forget about, not replace your doctor. Just explain the mechanism. Walk you through what's actually happening in your body when certain symptoms show up, and why certain foods speak to those symptoms in a way that makes biological sense. By the end of this, you should feel less like you're memorizing health tips and more like you understand something real about how your body communicates. Because once you understand that, you start noticing things you've been ignoring for years. Let me start with something that almost everyone has experienced and almost no one has thought carefully about. The headache that shows up in a specific, predictable way. Not a migraine, not something that needs medication, just that dull, persistent pressure that tends to arrive in the afternoon, or after a long flight, or the morning after you didn't drink enough water, or after an intense workout. Most people take ibuprofen and move on. Some people wait it out. Almost nobody thinks about what the headache is actually trying to say, which is worth thinking about because that particular kind of headache, the diffuse tension-style headache that doesn't have an obvious trigger, is often a message about mineral status. Specifically about magnesium and potassium, two electrolytes your body burns through under stress, during physical exertion, and whenever you're running low on sleep or hydration. Magnesium is involved in over 300 enzymatic processes in your body. 300. It plays a role in nerve transmission, in muscle function, in blood pressure regulation, in blood sugar metabolism. One of the things it does is regulate how blood vessels dilate and contract, which is directly relevant to headache. A significant proportion of tension and vascular headaches are associated with low magnesium levels, and the research on magnesium supplementation for headache prevention is actually quite solid. The American Migraine Foundation considers it probably effective for prevention. The problem is that most people are subtly low in magnesium without knowing it, because magnesium is depleted by stress, by alcohol, by processed foods, by intense exercise, by medications like diuretics. It's one of the most common micronutrient deficiencies in the developed world, and it shows up quietly, not in a dramatic way, but in that low, persistent, hard-to-name background discomfort. Bananas sit at an interesting intersection here. They're not a high magnesium food in the way that dark leafy greens or pumpkin seeds are, but they contain a useful combination of magnesium, potassium, and B6, all of which play roles in neurological function and nerve signaling. The potassium specifically matters because magnesium and potassium work together in maintaining the electrical balance across cell membranes, and when both drop, which happens together during sweating, during stress, after a night of drinking, The result is often that specific kind of head pressure that tells you something is off. Eating a banana isn't a cure for a serious headache, but for the depletion-driven tension headache, it's addressing the actual cause rather than just covering the signal. That's a meaningfully different approach, even if the banana and the ibuprofen both make you feel better. There's something worth saying here about the difference between treating a symptom and responding to a signal. Your body is a communication system, and every symptom is information. Headaches, fatigue, digestive discomfort, poor sleep, brain fog, these aren't malfunctions, they're messages. The message is usually something about what's missing, what's accumulating, what's out of balance. The problem is we've been trained to treat symptoms as inconveniences to be silenced rather than signals to be read. You take the ibuprofen not because it addresses the reason for the headache, but because the headache is annoying and you have things to do. And that's fine sometimes. Pain relief is legitimate and valuable. But if the same headache keeps coming back in the same circumstances, maybe the useful question isn't how do I make it stop, but what is it trying to tell me? Usually it's telling you something quite specific, and the answer is simpler than you'd expect. This brings me to something that took me a long time to really sit with. The body almost always starts with the simplest possible distress signal before it escalates. Constipation before it becomes a bigger digestive issue. Dry hair before it becomes hair loss. Low energy before it becomes real fatigue. Mild inflammation before it becomes chronic pain. We tend to ignore the early signals. They're not dramatic enough to require action, and we're busy, and then we're surprised when something more serious shows up. But the early signals are actually the gift because they're the easiest point at which to respond. And they're almost always asking for something surprisingly basic. Take constipation, which is one of the most common digestive complaints and one of the most undertreated because people are embarrassed to talk about it and assume it'll resolve on its own. It usually does. But chronic or recurring constipation is worth paying attention to because it's not just uncomfortable. It's a sign that something in the digestive process isn't moving the way it should. The large intestine needs two things to move contents efficiently: adequate fiber to bulk the stool and adequate water to soften it. Most people in the modern world are chronically low on both. They're eating processed foods with negligible fiber, they're not drinking enough water, and their gut microbiome, the community of bacteria that plays an enormous role in digestive function, is often depleted or imbalanced from a diet that doesn't support it. Apples are one of the more elegant responses to this, and the reason is a type of soluble fiber called pectin. Pectin is the substance that makes jam gel. It's a long-chain carbohydrate that becomes viscous when it absorbs water, and in your digestive tract it does something similar. It bulks and softens stool simultaneously, which addresses both sides of the constipation problem. But that's not the whole story. Pectin is also a prebiotic. It feeds the beneficial bacteria in your gut, which in turn produce short-chain fatty acids that support the health of the gut lining and regulate the motility of the intestinal walls. There's also sorbitol in apples, a sugar alcohol that has a mild osmotic effect, drawing water into the intestine. The whole package is almost designed for the problem. And there's a specificity here that matters. The pectin is concentrated in and just under the apple skin, which is why eating the whole apple, not drinking juice, which removes the fiber, makes a real difference. Your gut does something that most people don't know it does, and once you know it, you start seeing its relevance everywhere. It has its own nervous system, the enteric nervous system, sometimes called the second brain, made up of roughly 500 million neurons embedded in the lining of the gastrointestinal tract. This network communicates bidirectionally with your brain via the vagus nerve, which is why stress makes your stomach hurt, why anxiety shows up as nausea, why grief can kill your appetite. But it also works the other way. What's happening in your gut affects your mood, your cognitive function, your stress response. The gut-brain axis is one of the most active areas of current neuroscience research, and the emerging picture is that the health of your digestive system has downstream effects on mental clarity, emotional regulation, and even sleep quality that we're only beginning to map. This is part of why the recommendation around yogurt and bloating is more interesting than it sounds. Abdominal bloating, that uncomfortable distension that comes and goes, that makes your clothes feel wrong by the end of the day, is usually a sign of fermentation happening where it shouldn't be, by bacteria that shouldn't be doing it. When your gut microbiome is out of balance, certain bacteria overproduce gas during digestion, and that gas has nowhere to go fast enough. The conventional response is antacids or simethicone. The deeper response is to work on the microbiome itself. Probiotic-rich yogurt, the kind that says live and active cultures on the label and actually means it, introduces beneficial bacterial strains that compete with the dysbiotic bacteria responsible for excess fermentation. It doesn't work overnight, and the effects vary depending on the individual and the specific strains involved, but consistent consumption does appear to shift the microbial balance in a direction that reduces bloating over time. The mechanism is real. The time frame is slower than people want. And the caveat that matters: if you're lactose intolerant, dairy yogurt may make bloating worse rather than better, in which case a coconut yogurt or kefir alternative with the same live cultures is the more useful choice. The second brain concept has one more implication worth sitting with before we move on, because it loops back to something that seems completely unrelated: sleep. Most people think about sleep as a neurological problem: melatonin, cortisol, blue light, screen time, and all of those things matter. But sleep is also deeply connected to what you eat and when, and specifically to serotonin, which is the neurotransmitter that precedes melatonin in the sleep initiation cascade. Your brain converts serotonin to melatonin as evening comes on, which is part of what makes you feel sleepy. And about 90 to 95% of your body's serotonin is produced not in your brain but in your gut, by specialized cells in the intestinal lining. The gut makes serotonin. The brain converts it. The health of your gut affects how well that process works. This is why the research on kiwi and insomnia is more interesting than it initially appears. It's a small study, I want to be honest about that, but participants who ate 2 kiwi fruits an hour before bedtime for 4 weeks experienced a 35% reduction in the time it took to fall asleep, improved total sleep time, and better sleep efficiency. The researchers attributed this to several factors. Kiwis are unusually high in serotonin for a fruit. They contain antioxidants that may support the enzymes involved in the serotonin to melatonin conversion, and they provide folate, whose deficiency has been linked to insomnia. None of this is fully established science, and I want to be careful about overstating it. But it's also not a coincidence or a health myth. There's a plausible mechanism, there are studies that support it, and the downside of eating a kiwi before bed is essentially zero. For the kind of insomnia that isn't rooted in clinical anxiety or sleep apnea, the kind that's just the brain refusing to quiet, the kind that shows up when you lie down and your thoughts decide that now is the time to process everything, it's worth trying before you reach for melatonin supplements, which have their own complicated relationship with your body's natural production cycle. Speaking of things worth trying before reaching for the pharmacy, if you have ever had a bad sore throat, you know the specific misery of it. The sharpness when you swallow, the rawness that makes eating feel punishing, the way it gets worse in the night when you're trying to sleep and better in the morning when you're not thinking about it. The standard response is lozenges, throat spray, maybe antibiotics if it progresses to something bacterial. All reasonable. But honey, real honey, not the stuff that's mostly corn syrup, has a body of research behind it for sore throat that is more robust than most people know. The BMJ published a systematic review finding honey superior to usual care for upper respiratory symptoms. The WHO endorses it as a demulcent for sore throat relief. It works through several mechanisms simultaneously. It coats the irritated tissue, reducing friction and the sharp sensation when swallowing. It has significant antimicrobial properties from hydrogen peroxide, methylglyoxal, and other compounds. And it has demonstrated antiviral activity in some laboratory studies. The thickness of it matters. It sits on the inflamed tissue longer than liquids do, which extends the therapeutic contact. A tablespoon in warm water with a squeeze of lemon isn't folk medicine. It's a delivery mechanism for something that genuinely has pharmacological activity, just not in a pill. A tablespoon in warm water with a squeeze of lemon isn't folk medicine. It's a delivery mechanism for something that genuinely has pharmacological activity, just not in a pill. The cloves thing is similar, and I want to explain it because it's one that sounds most like an old wives' tale and is actually one of the most chemically justified entries on this list. Toothache, specifically the kind that comes from an exposed nerve, a cracked tooth, or an inflamed pulp, is one of the more unpleasant pains a person can experience, partly because of the pain itself and partly because of the helplessness of it. There's almost nothing you can do from the outside, and you're usually waiting for an appointment that isn't for another 2 days. Cloves contain eugenol, a naturally occurring aromatic compound, in concentrations of roughly 70 to 90% of the essential oil. Eugenol has been used in dentistry for more than a century. It's the active ingredient in ZNO paste, the material dentists use to pack temporary fillings. It works as an analgesic and anti-inflammatory specifically in dental tissue. A 2006 trial found clove oil as effective as benzocaine gel, a standard topical anesthetic, for dental pain relief. You press a whole clove against the painful tooth, or apply a small amount of dental care. It is legitimately effective in a way that has been clinically measured. This is not a superstition. I want to pause here and say something about the nature of these remedies collectively, because I think it matters for how you receive the rest of this. None of these foods are cures. None of them replace diagnosis, and none of them should be used as an excuse to avoid addressing something that genuinely requires medical attention. Toothache from a dying nerve needs a dentist, not just cloves. Hypoglycemia in a diabetic context requires medical management, not just dates. Inflammation that has been present for months needs to be investigated, not just pineappled away. What these foods are is appropriate first responses and ongoing support. Things your body can use right now that move the situation in the right direction while you figure out whether something bigger is going on. There are also things that work with how your body actually functions rather than around it, which is why they tend not to have side effects, why they tend not to create dependency, and why they tend to have effects that extend beyond the immediate symptom they're known for. The energy one is a good example of this. Oranges for lack of energy. It sounds like the vaguest possible health tip. But lack of energy is not one thing. It's at least 4 or 5 different things that feel similar from the inside: low blood sugar, dehydration, low iron, low vitamin C, which affects iron absorption, and the kind of mental fatigue that comes from insufficient sleep or stress. Oranges speak to several of these simultaneously. The natural sugars, primarily fructose and sucrose, provide available fuel for cells that are running on empty. The water content, oranges are about 87% water, addresses mild dehydration. The vitamin C, a single medium orange contains roughly 70 milligrams, nearly the full recommended daily value, to something that's less commonly understood. It significantly enhances the absorption of non-heme iron from food. Non-heme iron is the form found in plant sources, and it's substantially less bioavailable than the heme iron in animal products. Vitamin C converts it into a form the intestinal cells can absorb more readily, which is why the iron deficiency fatigue that's common especially in women and vegetarians can be partly addressed not just by eating more iron-rich foods, but by eating those foods alongside vitamin C sources. The orange doesn't fix iron deficiency anemia, but it makes the iron you're eating work harder, and over time that compounds. Dates for hypoglycemia is worth explaining in similar detail, because the mechanism is more nuanced than it appears. Hypoglycemia, low blood sugar, can range from the mild afternoon slump that most people experience occasionally to the serious medical emergency that requires immediate intervention in people with insulin-dependent diabetes. I'm not talking about the medical emergency here. That requires fast-acting glucose specifically and is a clinical situation. I'm talking about the common functional hypoglycemia that comes from eating a high-carbohydrate meal, having a sharp insulin response, and then crashing a couple of hours later, or from going too long without eating and feeling shaky, irritable, and foggy. Dates are an interesting response to this because of their unusual sugar profile. They contain roughly equal amounts of glucose and fructose, with a glycemic index that's moderate despite their sweetness, somewhere in the 40 to 55 range depending on variety, which is lower than white bread and similar to brown rice. The glucose provides immediate blood sugar restoration, while the fructose, which the liver processes more slowly, provides a sustained lift that helps prevent the secondary crash. They also contain fiber, which slows the overall absorption. 2 or 3 dates restore blood sugar meaningfully without the spike and crash pattern that comes from eating candy or drinking juice, which makes them a more intelligent response to the symptom than reaching for a granola bar full of added sugar. Hair is something people treat as a cosmetic problem, and sometimes it is, but dry, brittle hair that doesn't respond to conditioner, hair that breaks easily, hair that's lost its texture or its shine. This is usually the skin telling you something about what's happening inside. Hair follicles are among the most metabolically active tissues in the body. They require continuous supply of nutrients to do what they do. When those nutrients are scarce, the body's triage response is to redirect resources to organs it considers more critical. Hair gets deprioritized. Nails get deprioritized. Skin gets deprioritized. These are the canaries. Salmon addresses dry hair specifically because of its omega-3 fatty acid content, primarily EPA and DHA. These are the structural fats that make up cell membranes throughout the body, including in the scalp and the hair follicle itself. The sebaceous glands in the scalp, which produce the natural oils that coat and protect the hair shaft, require adequate fatty acids to function properly. When you're chronically low in omega-3s, which most people in the modern Western diet are, because the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio in processed foods is wildly imbalanced, sebum production decreases, the scalp becomes dry and irritated, and the hair shaft loses the natural coating that gives it moisture and shine. The omega-3s in salmon also have anti-inflammatory effects on the scalp, which matters because scalp inflammation is one of the less discussed contributors to hair quality issues. Beyond the fats, salmon provides protein. Hair is made almost entirely of keratin, a structural protein, as well as B12 and selenium, both of which are important for follicle health. The dry hair that conditioner can't fix is usually not a conditioner problem. It's a nutrition problem, and salmon is about as efficient a nutritional response to that specific problem as you'll find in a single food. Bell peppers for brittle hair works through a different but related pathway. Vitamin C, which is essential for collagen synthesis. People think of collagen as a skin thing, and it is, but collagen is also a component of the connective tissue that anchors hair follicles in the scalp. Adequate collagen support means follicles that grip the hair shaft properly, that have the structural integrity to function through the hair growth cycle. Vitamin C also supports the production of sebum, again, the natural oil, and is required for the conversion of several B vitamins into their active forms. A single red bell pepper contains roughly 3 times the vitamin C of an orange, which surprises most people who still think of oranges as the vitamin C food. The brittleness, specifically hair that snaps rather than bends, is often related to weakened structural protein, which traces back to the collagen question, which traces back to vitamin C. The supplement industry sells this as collagen powder at significant expense. A red bell pepper costs less than $1. Memory is something everyone worries about as they get older, and the worry usually arrives before the problem does. You misplace your keys, you blank on someone's name, you walk into a room and forget why, and the part of your brain that tracks such things starts keeping score. Usually it's nothing. Usually it's the normal cognitive load of a life that has too many things in it. But the underlying health of the neural tissue, the synaptic density, the efficiency of neurotransmitter signaling, the blood flow to prefrontal regions, is affected by what you eat over time, and there's a class of compounds called flavonoids, specifically the anthocyanins that give blueberries their dark color, that have a real and documented effect on cognitive function. The research on blueberries and memory is more serious than wellness content usually makes it sound. A study published in the European Journal of Nutrition found that older adults with early memory decline who consumed daily wild blueberry powder for 6 months showed improvements in immediate recall and reduced memory interference, the tendency for similar memories to get confused with each other. Other studies have found associations between long-term blueberry consumption and reduced risk of cognitive decline in aging populations. The mechanism is primarily through the anthocyanins' ability to cross the blood-brain barrier, which most compounds can't do, and then to accumulate in regions of the brain associated with learning and memory, particularly the hippocampus. They appear to improve signaling between neurons, support the production of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a protein that promotes the growth of new neural connections, and reduce the oxidative stress and neuroinflammation that underlie most age-related cognitive decline. The effect's real, but they're cumulative. This isn't a food you eat before an exam to perform better. It's a food you eat consistently over time to build and maintain the architecture of cognition. The timeline is months, not hours. But that's how most of the genuinely important nutritional effects work. They're slow and they compound. Inflammation is the word that appears in health content so frequently that it's lost almost all meaning. Everything is anti-inflammatory these days: teas, supplements, diets, breathing practices, and this overuse obscures something that's genuinely worth understanding. Inflammation is not a disease, it's a process. Acute inflammation is how your body heals. When you sprain an ankle, the swelling and heat and redness are your immune system mobilizing, calling in white blood cells, increasing blood flow, beginning repair. That's inflammation doing its job. The problem is chronic systemic inflammation, the low-grade, persistent activation of the immune response that happens when the body is constantly dealing with something it's trying to fight, Whether that's processed food, environmental toxins, chronic stress, a gut microbiome that's out of balance, or excess adipose tissue that produces inflammatory cytokines on its own. Chronic inflammation is the background condition in most of the serious chronic diseases we struggle with: cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, certain cancers, autoimmune conditions, Alzheimer's. Reducing it isn't a wellness trend. It's one of the most important things you can do for long-term health. Pineapple contains an enzyme called bromelain, which is one of the more interesting compounds in the functional food world. Bromelain has been studied for its anti-inflammatory effects in the context of post-surgical swelling, sports injuries, sinusitis, and arthritis, and the research is reasonably compelling. The complication is the one I mentioned in my fact check. Most bromelain is denatured by stomach acid before it reaches the bloodstream in sufficient concentrations to have the tissue-level anti-inflammatory effects seen in clinical studies. When bromelain is used therapeutically, it's given in enteric-coated capsules that bypass the stomach. Eating pineapple gives you some bromelain, but a fraction of what's studied therapeutically. That said, pineapple also provides manganese, which supports antioxidant enzyme function, and vitamin C, which reduces inflammatory cytokine production through several pathways. The anti-inflammatory effect of eating pineapple regularly is real, just more modest than supplement marketing would suggest. Think of it as one piece of an anti-inflammatory diet rather than a treatment for inflammation. The cumulative effect of eating this way, reducing refined carbohydrates, increasing antioxidant-rich foods, including omega-3 sources, eating fermented foods, is significantly more powerful than any single food, however good, could be on its own. Skin is the organ that most directly reflects what's happening internally, and yet we spend more money trying to fix it from the outside than addressing anything inside. The skincare industry is enormous, and there is genuine value in some of what it offers: sun protection, hydration, specific actives for specific concerns. But the kind of skin that simply looks healthy, that has tone and clarity, and that thing people describe as a glow, is mostly a function of circulation, hydration, and the presence of specific nutrients that support skin cell production and turnover. You cannot serum your way to that. You have to eat your way to it. Carrots contain beta-carotene, a provitamin that your body converts to vitamin A, retinol, which is one of the most important nutrients for skin health. Vitamin A regulates cell turnover, the rate at which old skin cells are shed and new ones produced. And without adequate vitamin A, cell turnover slows, dead cells accumulate on the surface, and the skin becomes dull, rough, and prone to breakouts. Retinoids derived from vitamin A are among the most studied and effective skincare actives in dermatology: tretinoin, retinol, retinol, but all of those are essentially delivery mechanisms for the same biological process that dietary vitamin A supports more gently and sustainably. Beta-carotene also functions as an antioxidant, protecting skin cells from oxidative damage, including UV-induced damage. And there's one more thing that's both unusual and well documented. People who consume consistently high amounts of dietary carotenoids develop a slight warm, golden tint to their skin from carotenoids depositing in the subcutaneous fat layer. Studies have found the skin color, which can be achieved through diet in a matter of weeks of consistent carrot and leafy green consumption, is rated as more attractive than skin modified by sun tanning. The glow is real, and it comes from the inside. Cucumber for dehydration is the most modest claim on this list, and I want to be straightforward about that. Cucumbers are approximately 95% water, which does make them a meaningful source of hydration, particularly if you're someone who finds it difficult to drink enough plain water throughout the day. The texture and mild flavor of cucumber make it more appealing to some people as a hydration vehicle. They also contain electrolytes, potassium, magnesium, small amounts of calcium. But if you are genuinely dehydrated, if you've been exercising heavily in heat, if you're ill with vomiting or diarrhea, if you've been traveling in a hot climate without drinking, cucumber is not going to be sufficient. Genuine dehydration requires water, and in more serious cases, electrolyte replacement in volumes that cucumbers can't realistically provide. Where cucumber is genuinely useful is in mild, everyday dehydration, the kind most people are in most of the time without knowing it, the chronic low-level underhydration that shows up as afternoon fatigue, headaches, poor concentration, dry lips. Making cucumber a regular part of what you eat contributes meaningfully to daily fluid intake, especially in the summer months. It's not a dramatic intervention. It's a useful daily habit. There's a pattern running through everything I've described that I want to name explicitly, because I think it's the most useful thing to take from all of this. Your body uses symptoms as a vocabulary. The headache is a word. The dry hair is a word. The bloating, the fatigue, the brittle nails, the foggy thinking. These are all words. They're saying something specific, and the specificity usually points towards something that's missing or accumulating. Low magnesium says headache. Low omega-3 says dry hair and dry skin and possibly low mood and possibly higher inflammation. Depleted gut microbiome says bloating and inconsistent energy and sometimes anxiety. Low vitamin C says brittle connective tissue and poor wound healing and potentially impaired immunity. Low hydration says fatigue and poor concentration and constipation and headaches again. The symptoms stack because the deficiencies stack because modern diets create multiple simultaneous deficiencies, because we're eating in a way that's designed for shelf stability and palatability rather than symptom to overall well-being. When you fix your omega-3 status with salmon, your dry hair improves, but so might your mood, your inflammation levels, your cardiovascular risk profile, and your cognitive function. When you eat blueberries consistently for your memory, you're also supporting vascular health, reducing systemic inflammation, and feeding a diverse gut microbiome. When you address your gut health with yogurt and apples and fermented foods, you're supporting your immune function, your mental health, your sleep, your metabolic function. The body is not modular. Everything connects. This is the thing that Western medicine, which I respect enormously, which has saved and extended countless lives, sometimes misses at the outpatient level. It's organized around treating discrete problems. This symptom gets this medication, this diagnosis gets this protocol. And for acute and serious illness, that precision is exactly what you want. But for the diffuse, chronic, low-grade wrongness that most people experience most of the time, the kind of not feeling quite right that never gets serious enough to take to a doctor, that framework doesn't have much to offer. There's no prescription for the gray fog. There's no medication for the energy that sits below the floor. There's no drug for the dull, persistent headache that keeps showing up. And so people just live with it, or they develop increasingly expensive supplement habits, or they try elimination diets, or they bounce between practitioners looking for someone who can name what's wrong. Usually what's wrong doesn't have a name. It's just the accumulated effect of eating in a way that doesn't give the body what it needs for years, and the body getting tired of waiting for something better. The good news, and I mean this genuinely, not as a motivational closer, is that the body responds quickly when you give it what it needs. Not to everything, not always. Chronic conditions that have been developing for years don't reverse overnight. But the basic metabolic processes that make you feel like yourself, the energy, the clarity, the sleep, the digestive comfort, the skin quality, the lack of that persistent background noise of low-grade symptoms, these can shift in days to weeks when the inputs change. Magnesium status can normalize within a week of consistent intake. Hydration effects are often felt within hours. Gut microbiome begins to shift meaningfully within 2 weeks of consistent dietary change. The responsiveness of the body is underestimated because people expect dramatic, rapid transformation and instead get a quiet, gradual improvement that they almost don't notice until one day they realize they haven't had that headache in 3 weeks, and they've been sleeping better, and they haven't felt that mid-afternoon crash. I want to come back to where I started, which is that moment of waking up feeling off. Not sick, just wrong. The headache sitting behind your eyes. The energy that hasn't arrived yet. The low, specific discomfort that doesn't have a name. What I've tried to give you here is a way of reading that moment differently, not as a malfunction to be suppressed or waited out, but as a communication to be understood. Your body is speaking. It's almost always saying something simpler and more addressable than you'd guess. It wants magnesium or water or fiber or a specific fat or a specific micronutrient that happens to be missing from the food you've been eating. It wants you to pay attention to what's going on rather than push through until something gets serious enough to require intervention. The foods I've described, the banana, the apple, the honey, the salmon, the cloves, the orange, the kiwi, the dates, the yogurt, the bell pepper, the blueberries, the cucumber, the pineapple, the carrot are not magic. They're not going to fix structural medical problems. They're not going to replace diagnosis or treatment when those things are genuinely needed. But they are real responses to real signals, backed by actual mechanisms that make biological sense, and they're available to you every single day in every grocery store. They cost less than supplements and work better than most of them because they deliver nutrients in the forms and ratios and cofactors the body has evolved to receive them in. They work with you rather than around you. Start small. Start with the symptom that's been bothering you the most. Try the food consistently for 2 weeks and pay attention. Notice whether the symptom changes, whether anything else changes along with it, because it usually will, because nothing in the body is isolated. Let that be the beginning of a different relationship with what you eat. Not something you do for pleasure or convenience alone, but something you do in response to how you actually feel, in conversation with what your body is actually telling you. That conversation has been going on for your entire life. You've just been too busy to listen. Most people, when they really start paying attention, are surprised by how much their body has been saying, and even more surprised by how little it takes to respond. The piece of this that gets almost no attention in any of the popular health conversation is how interconnected the deficiency picture actually is. You can't look at magnesium in isolation from vitamin D, for instance, because vitamin D metabolism requires magnesium as a cofactor. Which means if you're low in magnesium, and most people in the modern world are, your vitamin D supplementation may be working less effectively than it should, which has downstream effects on immune function, mood, calcium absorption, and a dozen other processes. You can't look at vitamin C in isolation from iron, because vitamin C is required for non-heme iron absorption, and non-heme iron is the form found in most plant foods. You can't look at B vitamins in isolation from gut health, because the bacteria in your colon produce several B vitamins that you absorb directly, so a damaged or depleted microbiome is also a B vitamin problem. The deficiencies are not discrete. They're a web. Pulling on one thread pulls others. This idea that the food matrix matters as much as the individual nutrient is one of the most important insights in modern nutritional science and one of the least communicated. The history of nutrition science has been largely a history of isolating individual compounds and testing them in isolation. Beta-carotene supplements in smokers actually increased cancer risk in one famous study, which was baffling. Beta-carotene from food is clearly protective for cancer risk. The difference is context. In food, beta-carotene travels with hundreds of other carotenoids and antioxidants and fiber compounds that modulate how it behaves. In a capsule, it's alone, at concentrations the body has never encountered from a food source, doing something different in the absence of its usual companions. The supplement is not the same as the food. The food is not just a delivery mechanism for the supplement. The food is the thing, and the thing is more than the sum of its parts. This matters enormously for how you think about the remedies we're talking about. Eating salmon for dry hair is not the same as taking an omega-3 capsule. Though omega-3 capsules are useful and have good evidence behind them, the salmon also gives you protein, selenium, B12, vitamin D, astaxanthin, a potent antioxidant that accumulates in the skin, and a specific fatty acid profile that differs from plant-based omega-3 sources in important ways. EPA and DHA, the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids in fatty fish, are the forms the body can use directly in cell membranes and in the production of anti-inflammatory signaling molecules called resolvins and protectins. ALA, the omega-3 found in flax seeds and walnuts, has to be converted to EPA and DHA first, and that conversion is inefficient, somewhere between 5 and 15%, depending on the individual and their genetics. This doesn't make plant-based omega-3 sources useless, but it does mean that for conditions where EPA and DHA are the relevant mechanism, dry hair, skin moisture, neurological function, inflammation, fatty fish are a more direct route than plant sources. The serotonin question is worth returning to in more depth, because I think it's one of the most underappreciated pieces of the picture. Serotonin is popularly understood as the happiness neurotransmitter, which is both true and misleading. Yes, serotonin is involved in mood regulation, but it's also involved in appetite regulation, in pain perception, in sleep initiation, in gut motility, in blood clotting, in cardiovascular function, and in the regulation of bone density. It does a lot, and the fact that 90 to 95% of it is produced in the gut, not the brain, is a piece of information that fundamentally reframes what it means to have low serotonin. Low serotonin is often treated as a brain problem with a brain-targeted solution, namely SSRIs, which prevent the reuptake of serotonin in neural synapses. And for genuine clinical depression, this is often the appropriate intervention. But for the kind of low-grade mood dysregulation that many people experience, the flatness, the reduced motivation, the shortened emotional range, the gut may be where the story actually starts. Your gut makes serotonin from tryptophan, an amino acid found in protein-rich foods. The process requires several cofactors, vitamin B6, iron, and magnesium. The gut bacteria themselves play a role in stimulating serotonin production by the specialized enterochromaffin cells that line the intestinal wall. A gut microbiome that's depleted of the bacteria that support this process through a low-fiber diet, through antibiotic use, through chronic stress may produce less serotonin, which means less available serotonin for the conversion to melatonin in the evening, which circles back to the sleep problem. Everything connects. The insomnia, the low mood, the gut discomfort, the afternoon energy crash, these are often not separate problems. They're different expressions of a system that's running below its optimal point, and the thread that pulls them together is often the gut. This is why addressing gut health with consistent dietary attention tends to have effects that extend well beyond the digestive system. People who start eating more fermented foods, more diverse fiber sources, more polyphenol-rich foods, report improvements in sleep, in energy, in mental clarity, in mood, changes they weren't expecting and didn't make the dietary change to achieve. The gut is doing more than digestion. It's managing much of your neurochemistry, a significant portion of your immune function, and a communication network with your brain that we're still in the early stages of fully mapping. When you eat a cup of yogurt with live cultures, you're not just adding bacteria to a tube. You're modifying the behavior of a system that has effects throughout your body. The blueberry question is worth spending more time on, because I think the mechanism is one of the most genuinely exciting things in current nutritional neuroscience. Anthocyanins, the blue-purple flavonoid pigments in blueberries, blackberries, purple grapes, red cabbage, can cross the blood-brain barrier. This is unusual. Most compounds in your diet don't get into the brain directly. The blood-brain barrier is selective and tightly regulated. But anthocyanins have been found in brain tissue in animal studies, and appear to accumulate preferentially in regions associated with learning and memory, the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex. Once there, they appear to do several things. They reduce neuroinflammation, which is increasingly recognized as a driver of cognitive decline. They promote the expression of BDNF, the protein that supports the formation of new synaptic connections, the biological substrate of learning and memory. They improve cerebral blood flow, which affects how quickly and efficiently neurons can communicate. And they act as antioxidants specifically in neural tissue, which is highly vulnerable to oxidative damage because of its high metabolic rate and its high concentration of polyunsaturated fats. The practical implication of this is that blueberries are one of the few foods with specific, documented benefits for brain health at the cellular level. Not just through general antioxidant activity, but through mechanisms that are specifically relevant to how memory and cognition work. A cup a day for a couple of months is what most of the positive studies used. Frozen blueberries work as well as fresh for most of these purposes. Wild blueberries have higher anthocyanin concentrations than cultivated ones. And the effects, again, are cumulative. This is not acute like the kiwi and sleep, where you might notice something in a couple of weeks. This is the slow, compounding biology of building and maintaining neural architecture over months and years. The people who benefit most from consistent blueberry consumption in the research are older adults showing early signs of memory decline, but the underlying biology suggests that building this habit in your 30s and 40s is also building infrastructure for the decade after that. The curiosity I find myself returning to most often in all of this is the question of ancient knowledge. Before there was nutritional science, before there were randomized controlled trials, before there was any framework for understanding vitamins or enzymes or gut microbiomes, people knew things about food and health that we're now confirming through molecular biology. The use of honey for wound healing and sore throat predates recorded history. It appears in ancient Egyptian medical texts, in Ayurvedic medicine, in traditional Chinese medicine. The use of cloves for dental pain is documented across multiple ancient cultures on different continents that had no contact with each other. The use of turmeric for inflammation is a foundation of Ayurvedic practice that modern research has confirmed through its effect on NF-κB signaling pathways in inflammatory cells. Ginger for nausea, peppermint for digestion, garlic for infection. The cross-cultural, cross-historical consistency of these remedies is not a coincidence. It's the result of thousands of years of empirical observation by people who were paying very close attention to the relationship between what they ate and how they felt, because that relationship was a matter of survival. We don't have that relationship anymore, mostly. We have food that's engineered to be palatable rather than nourishing, and we have a medical system that specializes in treating acute and catastrophic illness but has limited tools for the diffuse, chronic underfunction that characterizes much of modern life. The gap between those two realities is where the conversation about food and health lives, and it's a gap worth taking seriously rather than filling with either uncritical wellness marketing or reflexive scientific dye water in certain contexts. Your cells maintain a precise balance of electrolytes, primarily sodium, potassium, and chloride, inside and outside the cell membrane. Water follows these electrolytes. It moves through cellular membranes by osmosis to maintain the right concentrations on both sides. When you sweat heavily, you lose water and electrolytes together, and if you replace the water without the electrolytes, you can dilute your blood plasma, which creates a different kind of problem. This is the mechanism behind hyponatremia, the condition that has hospitalized and occasionally killed marathon runners who drank excessive amounts of plain water without electrolyte replacement. It's an extreme example, but it illustrates why hydration is not just about water intake. It's about maintaining the electrolyte balance that allows water to be properly distributed and retained at the cellular level. Cucumber provides water with small amounts of potassium and magnesium, which helps in this context. But more relevant for everyday hydration is the broader category of water-rich foods: cucumber, watermelon, strawberries, oranges, celery, which deliver fluid alongside the cellular context that helps retain it. People who struggle to drink enough water often find that eating more water-rich foods throughout the day addresses their hydration more effectively than trying to force down 8 glasses of plain water. Partly because the food matrix provides the electrolytes that help the water stay in circulation rather than being immediately excreted. The energy question is one that runs through almost everything we've discussed because energy, real, sustainable cellular energy, is downstream of so many other variables. Sleep quality, blood sugar stability, mitochondrial function, thyroid function, iron status, B vitamin status, hydration, oxygenation, cortisol rhythm. All of these feed into the experience of having or not having energy. The orange specifically addresses 2 of the most common contributors to energy depletion: blood sugar instability and iron absorption. But the orange is also part of a larger principle about how to eat for energy that's worth articulating, because it's the opposite of how most people actually eat. Most people manage their energy with stimulants, caffeine primarily, sometimes sugar. These work in the short term by masking the signals of fatigue rather than addressing its underlying causes. Caffeine blocks adenosine receptors. Adenosine is a compound that accumulates in the brain during waking hours and creates the sensation of tiredness. Caffeine prevents you from feeling it, but the adenosine is still there, and when the caffeine wears off, you feel it all at once, which is why the afternoon crash hits harder after a morning of heavy coffee consumption. Sugar provides fast energy that spikes blood glucose and triggers an insulin response that often overshoots, dropping blood sugar below where it started. The sugar crash is a real biochemical event, not a figure of speech. Eating for actual energy means eating in a way that keeps blood glucose stable. Foods that provide complex carbohydrates alongside fiber and protein and fat, so that glucose is released slowly and absorbed gradually. Dates, counterintuitively, are a good example of this. Despite being very sweet, their combination of fiber, natural sugars, and a lower than expected glycemic index makes them a more stable energy source than most processed snack foods. Oranges work similarly. The fiber in the whole fruit slows the absorption of the natural sugars considerably, so you get sustained energy rather than a spike. The vitamin C in the orange then does its separate job of improving iron absorption from whatever else you've eaten recently, which addresses the iron deficiency fatigue that's common and commonly undiagnosed. The skin story is worth one more layer of depth, because I think the carrot-to-skin connection is one that people hear and mentally file under probably a stretch, without realizing how specific and documented the mechanism actually is. Vitamin A, the form your body makes from beta-carotene in carrots, is the only micronutrient for which there is strong, replicated clinical evidence of direct effects on skin cell biology. Retinoic acid, the active form of vitamin A, binds to receptors in skin cells that regulate gene expression, specifically, the expression of genes involved in cell differentiation, cell turnover, and the production of structural proteins like collagen and elastin. This is why tretinoin, the prescription retinoid derived from vitamin A, is considered the gold standard in clinical dermatology for aging skin. It works because it speaks directly to the regulatory machinery of skin cells. Dietary vitamin A from beta-carotene works through the same pathway, more gradually and gently. The carotenoid skin tone effect I mentioned is genuinely one of the more interesting findings in nutritional science for the past decade. Multiple studies, including work out of the University of St. Andrews, have found that high carotenoid status, achieved through consistent consumption of carrots, sweet potatoes, red peppers, leafy greens, produces a measurable warm, golden tone in the skin from carotenoid pigments depositing in the subcutaneous fat layer. Participants in these studies consistently rated high carotenoid skin tone as more attractive than suntan skin tone, independent of cultural background. The researchers described it as a healthy glow that signals internal health status to observers. It's not a myth. It's a real and visible effect of eating more beta-carotene-rich vegetables over a period of weeks. You can literally see good nutrition in someone's face if you know what you're looking at. Let me bring this back to where it actually lives for most people, which is not in research papers but in the ordinary texture of daily life. You're tired more often than you'd like. You sleep but don't always feel rested. Your digestion is fine most of the time but sometimes isn't. You get headaches that seem to come from nowhere. Your skin goes through phases you can't fully explain. You have stretches of good mental clarity and stretches where your thinking feels slow and effortful. Your energy is inconsistent in ways that don't track neatly with how much sleep you got. None of this is serious. None of it is worth calling a doctor about. It's just the persistent, low-grade underscore of a body that's not getting exactly what it needs, running on a fuel mix that's good enough to keep going but not quite good enough to feel the way you're supposed to feel. This is the conversation I wish more health content was having. Not 10 superfoods that will change your life. Not supplements marketed as miracle cures. Not elimination diets that make eating into a source of anxiety. Just the honest, specific, mechanistic explanation of what your body is asking for when it sends these signals, and the reassurance that what it's asking for is almost always something that exists in real food that you can buy at any grocery store, eat without preparation, and afford without thinking about it. The remedies in this piece are not the whole answer. They're not a substitute for the basics: adequate sleep, physical movement, stress management, genuine social connection, time outdoors. They're not going to reverse serious chronic illness or replace medical care. But they are real responses to real signals, and they work with the biology rather than around it, and that difference matters more than it might seem. A body that's being heard tends to quiet. A body that's being consistently ignored tends to escalate. You've been ignoring yours, most likely, in the same ways most people do. Not maliciously, not carelessly, just because that's the default mode of modern life. Push through, power past, treat the symptom, wait for things to improve on their own. And they often do improve on their own, which reinforces the waiting strategy. But they improve more quickly and more completely and stay improved longer when you meet the signal with something that actually addresses it. The banana for the headache, the apple for the constipation, the honey at the back of your throat, the salmon twice a week, the kiwi an hour before sleep, the yogurt in the morning, the blueberries in the afternoon, the orange with your lunch when you're running low. These are not dramatic interventions. They're not going to transform your life in a week. But they are the beginning of a different kind of relationship with your own body, one where the signals get listened to rather than suppressed, where the food you eat is doing something intentional rather than just filling you up, where the conversation that's been going on between your body and your environment your entire life becomes something you're actually participating in rather than waiting out. Most people, when they start paying that kind of attention, are surprised by two things. The first is how specific the signals actually are, how reliably the same symptom points toward the same deficiency, once you know the language. The second is how quickly the body responds when it finally gets what it's been asking for. Not always dramatically, not always immediately, but consistently, and often in ways that extend beyond the presenting symptom to a general sense of things being more right than they were before. That's not magic. That's nutrition doing what nutrition is supposed to do. Your body has been talking to you for years. It's patient and persistent and specific. You just needed someone to explain what it was saying. There's a concept in nutritional medicine called nutrient synergy, and it's worth understanding because it's the reason why eating diverse, whole foods tends to produce better health outcomes than eating a restricted set of healthy foods or relying on supplements to fill gaps. Nutrient synergy refers to the way specific nutrients enhance each other's absorption, activation, or effects when consumed together. Vitamin D and calcium, you've probably heard this one. Vitamin D is required for calcium absorption, which is why taking calcium without adequate vitamin D is much less effective. Vitamin K2 and vitamin D work together to ensure that calcium is deposited in bone rather than in arterial walls. Iron and vitamin C, as I mentioned, with vitamin C dramatically improving non-heme iron absorption. Zinc and vitamin A. Zinc is required to mobilize vitamin A from liver stores. So adequate zinc status is necessary for vitamin A to be available when needed. Magnesium and vitamin B6. They work together in hundreds of enzymatic reactions and deplete each other when one is absent. The implication of this is that targeted supplementation, taking isolated nutrients to address specific deficiencies, often works less well than it should, because the cofactors required for those nutrients to be absorbed and utilized are also potentially depleted. This is why doctors and researchers increasingly talk about whole food interventions and dietary patterns rather than individual nutrient supplementation. The food is already calibrated for these synergies, delivering nutrients in their natural ratios with the cofactors and compounds that allow them to function. When you eat a red bell pepper, which is essentially vitamin C in food form, with about 3 times the vitamin C of an orange, you're also getting vitamin A precursors, quercetin, a flavonoid with its own antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties, B6, folate, fiber, and water. The vitamin C doesn't show up alone. It shows up with its context, and the context makes it work better. This is particularly relevant to the hair and skin discussion. Brittle hair and dry hair are often treated as the same problem, which they're not. Dry hair, hair that lacks moisture and feels rough and breaks easily, is largely a sebum and essential fatty acid issue. Brittle hair, hair that snaps cleanly, that's hard and inflexible rather than soft and elastic, is more often a protein and structural protein issue, pointing toward collagen and the vitamin C that's required to synthesize it. The reason bell peppers show up for brittle hair specifically, rather than dry hair, is this distinction. The vitamin C in bell peppers is there for collagen synthesis, which provides the structural support that makes the hair shaft flexible rather than brittle. Salmon shows up for dry hair because omega-3s address the sebum and cell membrane question. Both are valid. They're addressing different parts of the same overall picture of hair that isn't getting what it needs. They just target different points in the mechanism. The collagen connection goes deeper than hair, which is worth following for a moment because it comes up in so many different places in this conversation. Collagen is the most abundant protein in the human body by mass. It's the structural scaffolding of skin, bone, cartilage, tendons, ligaments, and the walls of blood vessels. Its production declines steadily from about age 25 onwards, which is why skin gradually loses elasticity, why joints become less resilient, why wounds heal more slowly with age. The rate of this decline is influenced by several things you can't control: genetics, hormonal changes, and several things you can. Chronic sun exposure accelerates collagen breakdown. Smoking dramatically accelerates collagen breakdown. Consistently high blood sugar accelerates collagen breakdown through a process called glycation. And adequate vitamin C consistently decelerates collagen breakdown, because vitamin C is a required cofactor in the enzymatic reactions that cross-link collagen fibers into their functional triple helix structure. Without enough vitamin C, the collagen you produce is structurally weaker. With enough, the collagen you produce is denser and more stable. This is the mechanism behind scurvy, the vitamin C deficiency disease that killed sailors for centuries before anyone understood what was happening. The collagen throughout the body weakens and breaks down, producing bleeding gums, joint pain, wounds that reopen, and eventually hemorrhage. Scurvy requires severe, prolonged vitamin C deficiency. We're not talking about that here. But the milder end of the spectrum, the subclinical vitamin C insufficiency that produces collagen that's slightly weaker than it could be, skin that's slightly less elastic than it should be, hair follicles with slightly less structural integrity, is much more common than anyone acknowledges, because fresh fruits and vegetables are not as present in modern diets as they should be, and because vitamin C is water-soluble, not stored in large amounts, and needs to be replenished continuously. A red bell pepper, daily or close to it, is a meaningful contribution to maintaining the collagen infrastructure that holds much of your body together. The inflammatory pathway deserves more space too, because chronic inflammation is probably the most important concept in understanding long-term health, and most people have a very fuzzy picture of what it actually is and what drives it. I said earlier that inflammation is a process rather than a disease, and that's true. But the triggers for chronic, systemic inflammation are specific and largely dietary. The two biggest dietary drivers of chronic inflammation are excess refined carbohydrates and excess omega-6 fatty acids relative to omega-3 fatty acids. Refined carbohydrates, white flour, white sugar, processed grains, cause rapid glucose spikes that trigger inflammatory signaling through several mechanisms, including the activation of NF-κB, the master regulator of the inflammatory response. The omega-6 to omega-3 imbalance is less understood but equally important. Omega-6 fatty acids are precursors to inflammatory signaling molecules called prostaglandins and leukotrienes, while omega-3 fatty acids are precursors to the anti-inflammatory resolvins and protectins I mentioned earlier. The optimal dietary ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 is estimated to be somewhere between 2 to 1, and this is why dietary diversity, eating a wide range of plant foods with different fiber types and different polyphenol, has emerged as one of the most important dietary predictors of gut microbiome health. The bacteria need a varied diet. Different species prefer different substrates, and a diverse bacterial community requires diverse food to sustain it. Eating the same 5 things every week, even if those 5 things are healthy, produces a less diverse microbiome than eating 20 different plant foods across the week. This doesn't have to be complicated. Rotating through different vegetables, including legumes, including fermented foods like yogurt and kimchi and sauerkraut, eating different fruits across the season, these practices sustain microbiome diversity in ways that have measurable effects on inflammatory markers, immune function, and the neurochemistry downstream of gut health. I've taken you through a lot of mechanisms, and I want to end with something that brings it back to the practical and the personal. All of this matters, the magnesium and the anthocyanins and the gut microbiome and the collagen synthesis and the prostaglandin pathways, but it matters because it explains something you can actually do. You can eat a banana when your head hurts in that specific post-workout, didn't drink enough way. You can put honey in your tea when your throat is raw. You can add blueberries to your breakfast consistently rather than occasionally. You can eat salmon twice a week instead of once a month. You can have a kiwi before bed on the nights you know sleep is going to be a struggle. You can put a piece of physical cucumber in your water bottle if that makes you drink more throughout the day. None of these are dramatic. None of them require a special diet or a meal planning app or a consultation with a nutritionist. They require only the knowledge of why, and now you have that. You know why the banana addresses a depletion headache while the ibuprofen just masks the signal. You know why the honey sits on a sore throat and does real work while the flavored water in a lozenge mostly provides temporary psychological comfort. You know why the kiwi before bed is doing something meaningful in the serotonin to melatonin pathway rather than being a wellness myth. The mechanism is the thing that makes you actually do it, that makes you remember it when you need it, that makes you trust it when it works. Your body is running a conversation with you that has been going on your entire life. It's using the only language it has, sensation, symptom, signal, and it has been remarkably patient with the fact that you've been mostly not listening. It gives you the headache before it gives you something worse. It gives you the dry hair before it gives you the hair loss. It gives you the foggy thinking before it gives you the persistent cognitive decline. It gives you the low energy before it gives you the fatigue that finally makes you see a doctor. It starts small because it knows you're busy, because it doesn't want to alarm you, because it's built to work with whatever you give it. But it does have things it needs from you. It always has. The foods I've talked about in this piece are where you start. Not the whole answer. The whole answer is a life built around sleep and movement and relationships and time outdoors and stress that's manageable rather than chronic. But the foods are the part you can change today at the next meal with what's available at the grocery store you already go to. They're the immediate response to the signals that are already coming in. And they're real, grounded in biology, supported by research, consistent with the traditional knowledge that generations of careful observers built before anyone had the tools to understand why it worked. Start with one thing. The one symptom that's been bothering you most, that you've been most inclined to just push through or wait out or suppress. Find the food that speaks to that signal. Eat it consistently for 2 weeks and pay attention. Not because you'll be amazed and transformed, you might not notice anything dramatic, but because the practice of responding to a signal with something intentional rather than either ignoring it or suppressing it is the beginning of a different relationship with your body. One where you're in the conversation rather than waiting outside it. That conversation is already happening. It always has been. Now you know a few more of the words.